Please welcome Josh Freed, Senior Vice President of Third Way's Climate and Energy Program, and Alec Gallimore, Robert J. Vlasic, Dean of Engineering at the University of Michigan.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Third Way and our partners at the University of Michigan, welcome to our second Fastest Path to Zero Summit. We are thrilled you could join us virtually for the first day of what will be a 4-week series of Tuesday conversations on how the United States can get to the fastest, most equitable path to net zero emissions using every clean energy resource we have. This is also the mission of Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. We work with climate advocates, experts, and policymakers from across the country to develop policies and build support for bold action. Climate policy is too often driven by the voices from the coast. We firmly believe that this is a crisis that will only be addressed in the United States if the solutions are championed by the center of the country, in places like Macomb County, Michigan, Atlanta, Georgia, Pittsburgh, and Kenosha, Wisconsin. The goal of this event series is to bring together voices from across the country, and yes, including places like Washington, D.C., where I am, in California and New York, to wrestle with the sticky issues still in the way of the progress we so desperately need. Over the next 4 Tuesdays, with your collaboration, we'll have a set of conversations that look at what's at stake for the American economy, for the American people, and for the places we live in the face of increasing impacts of climate change. How much can innovation help address climate change, and can we really do it equitably? Will moving to clean energy really create the jobs we so desperately need in the midst of the pandemic-induced recession? And finally, what might the outcome of the 2020 election mean for climate and clean energy policy for the rest of this decade and beyond? Throughout this discussion, we'll also look at how climate action is related to and impacted by the other crises facing our country today: the pandemic, the recession, and renewed demands for racial justice. While we're not together in person this year, we really want to and are committed to fostering the sense of community that we had at last year's first Fastest Path to Zero Summit, and that we hope and expect to continue well into the future as we build a community and work to address these challenges. Also, don't forget, as you tweet about the conference, please use our hashtag #FastestPathToZero. Tell others about the favorite part of the conference this week and let them know what you'd like to see, and let us know what you'd like to see in coming weeks. We also appreciate that everyone treat each other with respect and dignity. We encourage everyone to acknowledge and review the code of conduct that we asked you to sign when you register for this conference, because we are committed to fostering a safe community without fear of online harassment, bullying, or any inappropriate action or behavior, where everyone can feel safe to share their thoughts and ideas. And we are really looking forward to hearing a broad set of creative, different, and exciting ideas throughout today and throughout the rest of this week. Now, I will turn it over to Alec.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be here. I'm so pleased to be joining you all. We're proud to co-host with Third Way this important series of discussions about the future of our planet. We're thrilled to be joined by such an esteemed and multifaceted group of leaders. Every year, it seems we endure more indications of the impact of climate change through generational extreme weather events, floods, hurricanes, wildfires. And I didn't even mention the data that exists. For example, earlier this year, NASA reported on a study of studies in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. In it, it reported that of 17 climate model projections from 1970 through 2007, 14 closely matched the actual outcomes. So no, climate change is not a hoax. Researchers worldwide are grappling with this epic challenge. It's a challenge of multiple dimensions with a variety of stakeholders and influencers. So what is the case for the Midwest as an important source of problem solving? I'll make 3 cases here. First, the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes represent more than 80% of North America's surface fresh water and 20% of the world's supply. More than 30 million people live in the Great Lakes Basin. An article last June in Scientific America, which reprinted from the online publication The Conversation, argued that climate change is creating conditions of excessively low and excessively high water levels. Second, the auto industry. According to National Geographic, vehicles produce 1/3 of all the air pollution in the United States. Here in Michigan, automakers are pursuing strategies to address CO2. Ford intends to achieve global carbon neutrality by 2050. The company will use 100% locally sourced renewable energy for all of its manufacturing plants by 2035. GM's vision is, quote, zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion, end of quote. The company is also committed to 50% sustainable materials in its vehicles by 2030. And finally, third, other factors. Politically, the Midwest's several swing states generate national attention from both major parties. And the Midwest is the home to 4 of the top 10 engineering colleges and schools in the United States, and 3 of the top 10 environmental policy management graduate programs. So it is fitting that we are here discussing an issue affecting the public around the world. The University of Michigan is one of the top public universities in the world. The university is the first US public institution to award degrees in engineering back in 1854. Today, Michigan Engineering takes pride in our mission of serving the common good. That mission is supported by the nation's top-ranked nuclear engineering department. It is also illustrated by our Blue Sky Initiative, which funds visionary research, including the Global CO2 Initiative at the University of Michigan. This multidisciplinary project aims to reduce the equivalent of 10% of CO2 emissions annually by 2030, and to turn those emissions into useful products. We embrace the charge and challenge of this summit to band together and center climate policies on people and communities beyond just the coasts, ensuring that our nation's path forward on climate change will be effective, that is data-driven, inclusive, that is all parties have a seat at the discussion table, equitable, fair to all populations, and enduring, not just a quick fix. In closing, let me say that we believe as engineers, ultimately our work is all about one thing, helping people. People everywhere share common needs and desires: food, shelter, water, opportunity, freedom, legacy. Those of us here today, through our leadership and partnership, can help fulfill them. Thank you for joining us as we seek to do our part to save the people of the world from one of the greatest crises of our time. It is now my sincere honor to introduce our keynote speaker. She is appropriately a native Midwesterner born in Madison, Wisconsin. She earned degrees from Spelman College, the University of Texas, and Yale Law School. She served for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, 7 as Democratic leader, and in 2018, as the Democratic nominee for the governor of Georgia, she won more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. She's described climate change as, quote, the greatest problem of the 21st century, end of quote. She is a New York Times bestselling author, serial entrepreneur, and founder of Fair Fight, a nonprofit created to ensure every American has a voice in our election system. And who knows, she just might be a future cabinet secretary. Please join me in welcoming Stacey Abrams.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Josh, for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. I am honored to be with you today because I was born in Wisconsin, grew up in Mississippi, and came of age in Georgia. I went to graduate school in Texas. I made a quick sojourn to Connecticut, but came back south as soon as humanly possible. But I believe I'm an exemplar of why we have to focus not simply on the coastal environments, but think about what's happening across the country. We're in the midst of multiple crises. We know that COVID-19 is ravaging our country, but it's also revealing challenges that so many of us have known for so long. We have a healthcare crisis, a pandemic that has claimed more than nearly 200,000 lives in the United States alone, that is disproportionately affecting communities of color across the country, particularly in the South. We are in the midst of an economic recession, a recession that is exacerbated by inaction and by a tension between what should be done and what must be done and by whom. But we know that this economic recession is devastating the very same communities that are disproportionately affected by the COVID healthcare crisis. And we know that there is systemic injustice that is being revealed and renewed, unfortunately, every day as we watch police accountability issues rise to the fore. But we have to pay attention to the full spectrum of systemic injustice and what that says about who we are as a nation and the future that we have. And of course, there is climate change. The climate change that we are watching play out in real time. The widespread wildfires that are damaging and ravaging the West. The 7 to 8 active hurricane systems in the Atlantic. And of course, just today, the announcement of even more breakage of the Greenland ice cap. We can limit our attention to where we are, or we can attack the catastrophes head on. And the litany of challenges that we face cannot be misrepresented, and they cannot be underestimated. But we also have to understand what precipitated them. These are intentional acts that have come about because of intentional attacks on science and on knowledge. We have watched for 40 years as unfortunately we have seen groups that have done their best to not simply tell us the things that are untrue, but to weaken our faith in science, to weaken our faith in facts. We have watched from the highest levels of government this very false equivalence between propaganda and truth. And this false equivalence, unfortunately, has bled into our educational system, our communications with one another, and unfortunately, our ability to respond to the crises that we face. Because of these challenges, because of this 40-year retrenchment from being a country that led on science, that led on facts, we have seen deeply, deeply consequential challenges arise. We have higher poverty levels, higher levels of inequality. We face healthcare crises that are combined with environmental challenges because air pollutants have run amok. And because unfortunately, even in this administration, we've seen more than 130 attempts to roll back regulations that were protecting our people. We know that communities are facing energy insecurity as we leave one of the hottest summers on record and head into what could be a devastating winter. We know that there has been extreme job loss and extreme weather, and these all have real consequences for the economies of our country, for the people of our country, and for the future of our country. But I'm here today because I know we can address these issues. We can address climate crisis. We can address the economic insecurity, and we can do it together. But what it requires is that we have a broader sense of who has a stake in this challenge and how we can work together to bring this challenge to solution. First and foremost, we have to break the myth that climate progress is bad economics. I served in the state legislature for 11 years. 11 years of arguing about whether climate change was real until I realized that I didn't have to convince people that they agreed with my premise as long as they agreed with our outcomes. And that's why I was very proud during my tenure as leader. I served as the Democratic leader for 7 years, and I formed and forged what was called a Green Tea Party Alliance. We were part of groups with the Tea Party and others that were able to move effectively on the issue of climate change, not simply by convincing people that they agreed with us on the issue, but convincing them they agreed with us on the outcome. We were able to block bills that would have attempted to weaken our stream buffer, that would have made it harder for us to protect our communities. Because I cared about climate change and they cared about property taxes. And part of our responsibility is to meet people where they are, even if they're not where we want them to be. That means that we have to have legitimate and thoughtful conversations that talk about climate progress, not simply as an end in of itself, but as a way to better economics for our communities. Because as we think about a third way, as we think about what's happening in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Georgia, in Alabama, what's happening across this country, people want better, but they don't know if they can afford it. And it's our responsibility to articulate how we can make it happen without losing what we have. Instead of alienating we have to aggregate allies. We have to think about how we can engender support in the electricity sector, in the building sector, in transportation, and in agriculture. Because if we can have the conversations about how we make things stronger, how we make things better, how we can save our climate and save our people and save our jobs, then that's when we make progress. And I know that we have the potential. I know we have the people, and I know we have the ingenuity. But it's going to require bold action at every level of government. We have to have federal leaders who actually understand what's at stake, but are willing to have conversations when they don't get everything they want the first time around. We have to engage state leaders, especially governors, those who have taken up the climate change crisis and those who've become reticent because they're afraid it can lead to loss of economics. And we have to be willing to have conversations at the municipal and county levels, at the school board levels, because at every level of government, if there are resources to be invested, there are resources to be maintained, and there are ways for us to improve our climate crisis. I created a few organizations when I did not become the governor of Georgia in 2018. One is known as Fair Fight with a focus on voter suppression. A second is Fair Count, working on making sure we have an accurate census. But the third organization I created is called the Southern Economic Advancement Project. SEEP was designed to have the conversation about how we move the South forward. And our first major paper, our first major investigation, was looking into how the South can be involved in climate progress. We have to recognize that all 5 states with the highest energy burdens in the country are located in the South. And we have to understand that these pose real challenges, because often the fossil fuel industry can be upwards of 10% of the state budgets. So it's not simply about saying we have to decarbonize and end use of fossil fuels, because the reality is we're talking about people's jobs, their livelihoods, their access to healthcare, their access to opportunity for their families. But we also have to understand that 58% of African Americans live in the South. 58% of the entire Black population in our country lives in the South. And so when we are fighting climate change, we are also fighting issues of racial injustice. And with growing populations among the Latino and AAPI community, and we can never forget the Native American community, we know that we have to intersect these conversations. But this intersection isn't simply about racial injustice. And again, it goes back to how people make a living and how they make a life. And so with SEEP, I was very proud of our work to talk about how the South can be involved, how the South can be a leader on climate progress, beginning by understanding what the challenges are and understanding that we can't simply elide them and go around them. We have to confront them head on, including, for example, the building sector. Georgia and across the South, we know that the building trades are a vital part of the economy in our region. But that's why we are urging energy efficient investment, making certain that when we are doing things at every level of government, energy efficiency is built into how the building trades do their work and how communities expect work to be done. We have to reduce in-home reliance on fossil fuels by funding investment. We know that in places where local governments have invested in energy opportunities for their homeowners and for their renters, we have seen climate progress. We have to look at building electrification and investing in that too. It is not enough to say it is good if we're not willing to put our money where our mouths are. And it's about strengthening building codes and strengthening zoning so communities aren't overwhelmed by the worst actors and they have opportunities to see what potential can look like. We also have to look, of course, at the energy industry. We have to look at creating renewable portfolios and clean electricity standards, but we have to make certain that we are understanding the transition that so many southern states, and I would argue southwestern states, have to make to meet these standards. Policies for stranded costs. Sounds a little technical, but I'm talking to the right audience because we know that as we see reduced financial burdens that are associated with deep decarbonization, we have to make certain that people aren't losing their jobs and their livelihoods on the promise of more. And that means we have to invest not only in building new, but we have to invest in reducing reliance. For example, having a power plant debt refinancing program that allows power plants to transition without losing jobs and without losing access to resources. But we must also think about transportation, particularly for communities of color and for the poor. When we think about climate change, if we think about transportation as a vehicle for climate progress, we actually make everyone's lives better. We can invest in electric vehicle policies, ones like what we had here in Georgia that unfortunately were so successful, one party decided they wanted to eliminate them. But we knew those policies were making progress by investing in electric vehicles, by investing in fleets, by making certain that those workers were driving clean vehicles. But we also have to think about expanding public transit. For so many of our communities that face economic insecurity, public transit is a transformational moment. And so we have to stop retrenching or stop retreating on the issue of public transit, and we have to advance. Because it's not about whether public transit turns a profit. It's how it transforms our communities into clean communities where exhaust fumes and pollutants aren't destroying our opportunities and where our community members have the ability to get to where good jobs are. We also have to increase walk and bike mobility, especially in the South that is so deeply reliant on cars. I know Michigan, you have a similar situation. We have to do the work of ensuring that we encourage walking and bike mobility, not simply in word, but in deed. And in the South in particular, but we know this is true again across the Midwest, we have to think about the agriculture sector. When I was running for governor, I traveled the state of Georgia, all 159 counties, and I spent a lot of time with our farmers, as I had for the previous 11 years that I've been in office. And through SEEP, we've been doing a lot of work with Black farmers, 45,000 of them strong, 90% of whom are in the South. And we know that if we want to see the kind of regenerative agriculture that we need, we've got to provide financial support and tech support. And that means as we look at new administrations at the state and federal level, we have to be intentional about investing in our future by investing in our farmers. We have to explore those regenerative ag practices that actually help improve not only their delivery, but also their processes and their legacy. We have to expand biodiversity in the South and across the country by investing in expanding public lands. And we have to recognize that we must invest in and regulate our coastal systems. Our coastal ecosystems are being ravaged. We luckily saw, I don't want to investigate too much, but we know that there's been a recent moratorium on drilling. And while that is important, it is not enough. I live in the South, but the South has a lot of coastline. And that means we have to think about not simply the East Coast or the West Coast, but we have to think about all of our waterways and all of our communities that are affected, particularly by the extreme weather events that are ravaging the South. Fundamentally, I'm here because I believe in progress. I believe that environmental justice is possible, that climate progress is possible. I believe in the intersectionality of who we are and what we do because I've lived it. As a college student at Spelman, I spent time 2 different summers working first for the Environmental Criterion and Assessment Office of the US EPA, and then working for the newly created Office of Environmental Justice. And I did that work not because I grew up talking about environmental issues. I grew up spending time with my great-grandmother, who we called Mumu, listening to her talk about the land, about the farm that she had grown up on as a sharecropper, and about the tiny little plot that she had created behind her house. I know the legacy of the land and the legacy of our air. I know how important it has been for so many communities to find their way because of the environmental connections that we have. And climate progress is essential if we are going to continue to build a legacy of trust, a legacy of opportunity, and a legacy of progress. Whether you come at this as a scientist, as an activist, as a policymaker, our fundamental obligation is to come at this together, to understand that there is a third way. We don't have to fight, we don't have to give in, but we do have to have our eyes on the very clear prize of climate progress in the immediate moment. And that means voting for leaders who understand us, who are willing to invest and willing to put their political reputations on the line for progress. It's filling out a 2020 census that seems disconnected, but tells the story of who we are and where we are and what we need. And it's about remaining committed and remaining engaged after November, because the work that we must do is not simply about protesting in the streets or protesting at the ballot box, although both are essential. We have to protest through our participation in policymaking and in the future of our country, because we can't afford not to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leader Abrams, for an incredible opening to the second Fastest Path to Zero Summit. Please welcome Kendra Pierre-Louis, climate reporter for Gimlet.
Thank you everyone for joining us, and I really would like to introduce our panelists today. So without further ado, let me introduce Peggy Shepard, the co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit organization We Act for Environmental Justice. We have Dr. Jonathan T. Overpeck, who's a climate scientist and the Samuel A. Graham Dean of the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. And we have Congresswoman Castor, who represents Florida's 14th Congressional District. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And so I know that we don't have a ton of time today, and so I'm gonna cut straight to the chase and start opening up with the hard questions, which is, more than 200,000 people across this country have died from COVID-19. Many who recover may be sort of saddled with potentially lifelong consequences and health effects. We are in the middle of what some are calling a racial uprising. Many people are unemployed. Food prices have risen, even as the number of people unemployed have decreased. And some might say that we have enough problems to be dealing with without focusing on climate change. So what would you say to them, and why would you say we need to think about climate change right now in this moment? And anyone who wants to start, go for it.
Well, extreme weather continues, and it's getting more severe and unpredictable each year in its intensity, its frequency, and its duration. And we now have the dual threats of COVID and extreme weather, which really threatens an effective response to the pandemic. People need to evacuate. They need to go to shelters in times of social distancing. So when we think about mass sheltering and evacuations, it increases the risk of viral transmission by moving large groups of people and gathering them close together. So this is really an important issue to discuss as both crises collide together.
Yeah, Peggy is right. Our task is urgent. We are running out of time. Lately the West Coast fires, Hurricane Sally bearing down on the Gulf Coast as part of the most active hurricane season. But what we've experienced in the past few years are the hottest years on record. Plus these climate impacts and dirty air exacerbates COVID. If we do not take swift and ambitious action, the science tells us that these climate impacts will get worse. Plus, here we are, we're a few months since the House Democrats have released our Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan. We released it shortly after the death of George Floyd. And many folks wondered, why would House Democrats release our report at that time when America was experiencing a reckoning with systemic racism? But we wanted to answer the peaceful protests that our Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan provides some solutions for equitable climate action, a lot of what Peggy has been working on her entire career. But why is this point in time also important? Because it provides a way forward. We need to jumpstart the economy, and clean energy, clean water, more resilient communities provide tremendous opportunities to strengthen and enlarge the middle class with new manufacturing jobs, the clean electric vehicles and buses, the charging infrastructure, more energy efficient buildings, our modern electric grid. All of this will help provide a new economy, a modern economy, a more sustainable way of life, not just in the coming year, but for the long term.
It almost sounds like you're talking about, dare I say it, a Green New Deal?
Our report has been referenced as the Green New Details because it's 550 pages of actionable policy proposals where we don't start from scratch. We highlight existing legislation, and then right now we're hammering out the larger pieces of legislation that need to be enacted ASAP to get to net zero, clean economy as soon as possible, but no later, the scientists tell us, than 2050.
Dean Overpeck, do you have anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, if I lived in Florida, I would be voting for Representative Castor. That was wonderful. You know, I think as a climate scientist, someone's been studying climate for 40 years, it's also really important to realize that as much as our hearts go out to those who are suffering from COVID, the biggest problem that we're faced is really climate change. The deaths, the illnesses, the disruption of our economy, everything that goes along with COVID will pale compared to what will happen increasingly if we let climate change go unchecked. And I think someone has to just, everyone has to realize that. And I also think people have to realize that there are a lot of co-benefits from acting. And just like Representative Castor mentioned, there are jobs in this, and but there's more to it than that. If we tackle the biggest problem of climate change, which is fossil fuel burning and the emission of carbon dioxide and methane from those fossil fuels, we clean up the air. And right now in America, over 10,000 premature deaths per year just because of that pollution. So if we tackle climate change, we get rid of that pollution. The American Lung Association just this week released a report saying that if we go to electric vehicles, that will be good for America. That isn't even talking about climate change. So there's that benefit. The last benefit that everyone really needs to highlight is that the cost of renewable energy now for electricity and eventually for mobility, cars, buses, and trucks, is cheaper than that associated with fossil fuels. So we're already cheaper for electricity in many parts of the country. So this is a way for Americans to save money, clean up their air, and avoid a disaster that will be much more impactful in the long run for generations than the COVID has been.
I want to kind of piggyback on something both you, Dean Overbeck, and you, Ms. Shepard, had said, which is one of the things we know from COVID is the air pollution bit. And one of the things we know about COVID is that people who have grown up in areas that are systemically with way more air pollution than in other areas are far more likely to die from COVID, right? So like we're seeing this impact right there of maybe not climate change directly, but like a product of what is changing our climate and COVID intersecting in these ways. And you all have like somewhat really beautifully outlined some of the co-benefits that go with it, but it doesn't feel like that message is getting out into the wider world. We're still hearing like acting on climate involves these really broad trade-offs, and we're not hearing the benefits as much. And I guess I'm wondering, why do you think that is?
Well, you know, I don't think the general public really understands environmental exposures. And I think the recent Harvard study really exposed to the public that living in air pollution has really increased the risk of death from COVID. And that really continues to be a major contributor to the disproportionate death rate of Black people from the pandemic. And, you know, really startling, the researchers also found that just a small increase in long-term exposure to PM2.5, you know, which is fine particulates, really leads to a large increase in the COVID-19 death rate. So, you know, the study suggests that counties with higher pollution levels will be the ones that have higher numbers of hospitalizations, deaths, but also where many of the resources should be concentrated. So I think that there really can't be climate justice without environmental justice. And I think the study really underscores the importance of continuing to enforce existing air pollution regulations to protect human health. But we also know that the Trump administration has at least 70 rollbacks and another 30 being planned that all will reduce the quality of our air and subject more people to higher risk from COVID. But I also believe that, you know, we can't have climate justice without environmental justice. And I'm a little concerned that the newer emphasis on climate change advocacy kind of skips over environmental protection And, you know, I sometimes wonder whether climate advocates really understand the issues of environmental exposure and environmental protection concerns, because often the messaging is all about greenhouse gas reduction, but not about the need to reduce the co-pollutants that contribute to the escalating health disparities in this country among people of color and indigenous.
And what you're really getting at is partly a siting issue, right? Like, we use oil or natural gas or coal for electricity, and we have to burn it somewhere. And where we burn it, essentially where we put those power plants, are primarily in communities of color, primarily in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. And that's why we have this huge disproportionate
Absolutely.
Impact.
Absolutely. Right? And I think it's the first time that the general public is even hearing generally that air pollution can lead to increased risk of death. Of course, all of us working in this issue know that, but I don't think the general public has really understood that. And I think this pandemic has brought that home to them.
Anyone else want to chime in?
You know, in crafting our climate crisis action plan, we made a point of listening to environmental justice leaders like Peggy, and we traveled to Michigan last year and listened to the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, particularly about zip code 48217, the most polluted zip in America. And what we took away is that these benefits have to be tangible to people. That means that we've got to build resilience. When we say resilience, that means fixing our water systems, focusing on clean water, our wastewater systems, you know, making sure that flooding issues are addressed, making sure that we start in neighborhoods that have carried the environmental burden rooted in racism for decades. So that's what our plan does, and I highlight it to those who are looking for, okay, what is the plan? Where do we go? We've got the roadmap. We just have to act.
Something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially this summer, is the ways we know, like the National Climate Assessment has told us about wildfires, it has told us about hurricanes, it has told us about floods, it has told us about pretty much everything that we're seeing play out this summer. But I think the thing that really has been really hitting home to people for sort of the first time because of COVID, which is this underlying disaster that sort of encompasses everything we do, is the idea that they would be overlapping, right? So we're in the middle of a disaster through the pandemic, and then California's on fire, so that's another disaster in kind of a way that people are harkening back to 1910, the big burn. And then, you know, we had this unnatural hurricane year, or this unusually active hurricane year. Laura was already pretty devastating to parts of the Gulf Coast. And then almost as soon as those communities were hit by Laura, they then had to face a heat wave without electricity. And it just feels like it's been unending. And so I'm asking Dr. Overpeck in particular, but should we be preparing for these kinds of overlapping disasters in the future?
Absolutely. You know, what we're really talking about is trying to create a more sustainable society. And the society that we have now just isn't sustainable. And I'd like to highlight, first and foremost, you can't have sustainability without justice and environmental justice. And so we have to tackle that as part of the problem, as you're hearing already. But we're getting increasing with climate change. More and more disasters, just as we predicted, you know, 40 years ago, even longer, these things would happen. And in many cases, they're happening with a higher frequency and greater severity sooner than we thought they would occur. So there's a proclivity, I think, also out there. You know, I do a lot of Twitter, in the Twitterverse, to have these one solutions. It's got to be nuclear, it's got to be solar, it's got to be wind. You know, it's got to be building policies. Well, I think like what Representative Castor was reflecting on is that people who take this problem seriously are looking at all the solutions, because the goal here is to get out of this situation where we just keep getting disaster after disaster in an ever increasing clip. And we start to deal with the system to make it sustainable. We deal with everything at once. So we don't like It's not like whack-a-mole where we push down COVID and we get climate change, or push down climate change and we get, more injustice. So that's the secret, I think, in all of this. But one of the things I just wanted to highlight as a climate scientist is that most of the extremes that you mentioned, the heat waves, the supercharged hurricanes and their rainfall and their storm surge and their winds that are much higher than they used to be, the wildfire blow up out west, with this, by the way, isn't the first year that we've had that.
Yeah.
The mega drought, for the first time in the United States history, is gripping the Southwest and threatening the water supply of over 40 million people. All of these things are being supercharged by increasing temperatures. And that means a good thing. We know that with great confidence. And we know that it's these greenhouse gases that are causing that with great confidence. So it's like we've gone to the doctor and we've got an illness and the doctor is like, I know exactly what the problem is. We don't have to just treat the symptoms, we'll treat the cause. And that cause is the burning of fossil fuel and the other things we do to emit carbon dioxide, methane, and the other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So it's really good that we have such great scientific confidence. We know what we have to do.
Kendra,
Yeah.
Dr. Overpeck is so right. I mean, climate change is a threat multiplier. And I think the day after President Trump made comments mocking climate science, it's incumbent upon all of us to speak out. I mean, it wasn't surprising, unfortunately, but it was appalling nonetheless. And we simply cannot do this anymore. We've got to unite behind the science. And I'm hopeful because when you look at public opinion surveys, climate is not really something that folks disagree on. Folks understand that it's happening, and they understand part of the answer is their clean energy future, this exciting transition to clean energy. But we've got to be mindful that as we make these changes, that we're lifting up people who have historically been left behind and burdened with a lot of pollution and unfairness, inequity.
Yeah, and I think we also have to understand the comprehensive nature of these impacts on civil society. There'll be more climate evacuation, climate migrants trying to escape drought and flooding, and there'll be exploitation by climate gentrifiers who swoop in after disasters, buy up property, and create a whole new civil society, such as they've done in New Orleans and perhaps Puerto Rico and the Bahamas. So there are wide-ranging impacts of extreme weather that we all need to understand and address.
One thing that often gets held up as a barrier towards acting on climate is jobs in the economy, right? Like they say, like, we can't do anything because we need jobs and people need to work. But they're the unemployment rate nationwide right now is around 8%, I believe. And we had a stimulus plan, but it didn't seem to do much in terms of actually getting people employed. And I'm looking at what's happening in Europe, which my colleague at Gimlet chronicled on our podcast, which is like they're deliberately using the money to stimulate the economy, but they're putting it in green infrastructure to create jobs, as well as to move the needle on climate change. And I'm wondering what you think of that, really, like that approach versus sort of what we've been doing.
There are a lot of jobs in fighting the climate crisis, and a lot more jobs, for example, high-paying jobs than there are in the fossil fuel industry. Those jobs are going down in number, and the jobs in clean tech are going up. And it's not just providing jobs, it's retooling America's economy to be more competitive on the global stage going into the rest of the 21st century. Everyone around this planet is trying to do what we want to do, and we're talking about here, the transition to a clean energy, sustainable and just society. Why shouldn't America be at the forefront of providing the technology, the manufacturing, and the jobs that are necessary to meet the global demands? Or do we want to let China get that market share, or Europe? I think we all want to get pieces of that market share. And right now we need leaders in America who realize that's our future, not these old industries like the fossil fuel industry that are just killing people outright and are going to kill a lot more and hurt a lot more communities with climate change.
Representative Castor, I don't want to cut you off. But that brings to mind, this is slightly off script, but that brings to mind the fact that in some ways we're already playing catch up, right? Like most of the world's solar panels are produced in China. Most of the world's wind turbines are produced in Europe because we didn't, we kind of started doing it in the 70s, and then the 80s and the 90s, the federal government kind of pulled out of a lot of that basic research to kind of make those improvements, and now we're playing catch up. Is that inaccurate?
Oh, we can do so much better. We've got to build American and buy American, and that's why this is an enormous opportunity for Americans from all walks of life. But particularly, we believe we can provide pathways to good paying, family sustaining jobs as we march forward. You're going to hear next, I believe, from Brad Markell with the Blue Green Alliance. They were also instrumental in helping us craft our Solving the Climate Crisis plan, just like the EJ leaders across the country were. And we see enormous opportunities, but a lot of these jobs, we're going to have to be mindful, are going to have to be union-based jobs. They were going to have to provide those fair labor standards, and a lot of folks, there's a lot of pressure to cut corners and let the big corporate giants rule the day. And we simply can't do that if we're going to build that sustainable society that Peggy and Dr. Overpeck have heralded today.
What does a sustainable society look like to each of you?
Well, a sustainable society has to start out with equity and justice. We have to clean up the legacy pollution that has disproportionately impacted communities of color and indigenous areas for decades and decades, contributing to escalating health disparities. You know, there was talk about an infrastructure bill 4 years ago that would begin to repair, you know, our crumbling bridges and water pipes and, you know, so much infrastructure in our communities, especially the ones that have experienced so much disinvestment. Yet we still, you talk about playing catch up on green jobs, we still haven't, you know, shored up our failing infrastructure that was promised and committed to us 4 years ago. So we are playing catch up. And if we can really focus on really transformational economic development, we can begin to address the job shortage and the gaps that we have in job training and a pipeline to a job from job training that we so badly need in our communities.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a controversial question, I think, which is on at least controversial in the circles I hang out in, which is, you know, we're in an election year. It's kind of a big one. I'm not sure if you heard the news, but Scientific American today came out and endorsed Joe Biden. It's the first time in their 150 or 165 year history where they've ever endorsed a presidential candidate. And they specifically cited science as the reason why, effectively saying that one candidate you know, accepts science and the other one refutes it. And both their handling of the pandemic and the climate crisis sort of illustrates that problem. But how do you think, to what degree do you think that voters are going to respond to, at the polls, to what we're sort of experiencing in real time right now?
More than ever before, Americans will go to the voting booth this year and cast a vote for science. I believe what they understand that the executive branch's response to the pandemic has been disastrous, and they know the same when it comes to climate. But fortunately, Americans, especially young Americans, know that climate action gives us an opportunity to build a more resilient, sustainable economy and planet, and we're going to grow jobs in clean energy and community resilience, like like clean water and all of the wastewater plants. So, you know, I come from coastal Florida, and every major rain event, it can turn out to be pretty gross. But we've got to also build the capacity in the EJ communities and the advocates so they have a seat at the table as we move forward. And I think voters know that Democrats of all stripes are fighting to solve the climate crisis. But like I said before, Americans of all political persuasions know this is our future. They are on board. And that, you know, that there is a tired old argument that says we can't act on climate because it will hurt our economy. Voters know now that is not true, that these two things go together, that solving the climate crisis, it's hard work, but they understand we can create jobs, we can build back better, as Joe Biden says, and expand America's middle class. And they understand the cost of inaction on our health, on our families, and what's at stake for our future.
Yeah, you know, Third Way did a poll on African Americans, and again, we have confirmed that African Americans and people of color poll higher on, you know, supporting climate change issues than other folks. But, you know, I really believe that when it comes time to vote, people are going to think about, you know, will the federal government continue to provide flood insurance? Is FEMA providing equitable services to people of color? Can you provide documentation of your property ownership to receive insurance after flooding? Can small farmers survive, you know, given the extreme weather with no help from the government? I really hope people are going to vote in their best interests and not vote for a climate denier, as so much devastation comes in waves, destroying our homes, our jobs, and our society. We're really in the midst of a racial pandemic, a COVID pandemic, and a climate crisis. And I hope and think people will vote in their best interests.
Yeah, and as a scientist, I think what's important to realize, we've never had a president in the history of this country who has not only not understood science, but has denied science, and has done this actively while Americans are dying because of it. So I think Americans are going to respond to that. But I'd like to just, if I have just a second, yep. I ran on Twitter today into an article that was in The Atlantic. The Atlantic's getting a lot of interesting stories lately. And it was all about how, isn't it too bad that climate disasters aren't hitting in swing states? You know, it's California and Washington. And I was reflecting on that as a climate scientist, and I tweeted back, wait a minute, isn't Florida a swing state? Isn't Iowa a swing state where we've had record spring flooding and we had the derecho this year? Isn't Arizona a swing state now where they're in the, you know, this mega drought that's been going on for 21 years, and the flows of the Colorado River, the lifeblood of the Southwest, have gone down 20%, mostly because of the warming? You know, the thing is climate change is now affecting this entire nation. And I know people aren't going to vote for climate first. I would love to think they would as a climate scientist, but I think they understand the relationship between climate and their pocketbook. I think they understand the relationship between climate and justice and racism in this country. And I think they understand that all of these things together can't be separated out so neatly anymore, that we need to look at it in a systemic way and to solve the problems in a systemic way. And that will give us the sustainable world that we all want, a sustainable world with high-paying, you know, well-paying jobs and no climate change. So I think the voters will recognize that climate is part of their calculus going into the election booth, or, you know, to their postman if they're gonna mail in their ballot.
We have about 1 minute left. Thank you. So does anyone want to get in sort of like last statements or anything before the voice from God kicks us off?
Yeah, vote. Get all your friends to vote. Get all your enemies to, no, don't get your enemies to vote. Get everyone to vote. You know, I think just Americans have to turn out and tell our leadership what we really care about.
Call your grandparents in Florida, please, and encourage them to vote for your future.
and stop voter suppression. I understand that the post office has sent out incorrect information to voters. So really check your local, your local information on when and how you should be voting.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone out in the void
Thank you,
for joining
everybody.
us, and have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Kendra, Peggy Shepard, Dr. Overpeck, and Chairwoman Castor. Please welcome Adam Atten, reporter for E&E News.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We're lucky to have some great panelists here. Lynn Abramson is president of the Clean Energy Business Network. Brad Markell is labor co-chair and executive director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council. And Josh Freed is senior vice president of Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Josh, let's start with you. Biden wants to create a raft of new offices, new policies for environmental justice aimed at remedying some of these problems that we've seen, in the past decades of vulnerable communities, minority communities experiencing the brunt of pollution and other kind of negative effects from infrastructure policies. But at the same time, Biden is also promising to build a lot and build it very quickly. So how does he balance that? How does he balance environmental justice with a big, fast build out of climate infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam, and I think it's a fundamental part of the example of what we're going to be wrestling with the challenges that we face coming into, if there is a Biden administration, the need to address climate change urgently, the need to deal with the economic crisis, and also to recognize that environmental justice is not something that can be either just mentioned or put off to later or be an afterthought. And there are a couple of ways that I think we can see the Biden administration do that. First is we need to recognize that there is a critical role for government, and that means providing sufficient staff so that the processes that we ask government do, including reviewing in a timely manner, but also taking into account community needs, the environmental and economic, and particularly the environmental impacts of projects that are being considered, so that it doesn't take too long simply because our government is under-resourced and understaffed. And that has particularly happened with the assault that not just the Trump administration, but previous Republican administrations and unfortunately Republican Congresses have had. The other time is that we need to make sure that communities that are disadvantaged, communities that have been too often on the fence line of projects that result in more pollution are included from the start of the conversation. It really aligns with the philosophy that low-income and communities of color should not just be considered at the end, but they need to be actively consulted from the start so that as we're deciding where projects might be sited, the communities who are going to be impacted and get jobs and get reduced pollution and have the other benefits, or maybe on the line of more pollution, are actively considered and can be part of the process.
I mean, communities are one piece of the puzzle here. And I mean, industry and the renewable sector is another really important one. And we know that, energy and environment is a pretty white space. I mean, we can look around this panel and kind of see that. And the renewable industry, I seems is not, immune from that. Brad, tell us a little bit about how renewable, how has unionization gone in the renewable sector? I mean, we hear kind of anecdotally, fossil fuels companies and sectors seem to have a little bit better, unionization track record. What has been the experience so far with renewables and organizing workers in that sector?
Thanks, Adam. Well, it's not just anecdotal. There's a lot of data out there about the union density in renewables, which is almost nowhere, versus a very solid union density in fossil fuels. The pay and benefits differences are pretty stark as well. And basically this is just around the labor relations system and labor laws in the United States are broken. Low union density is not something workers want, it's something companies want. And so like most companies in a new sector, if renewable energy companies can get away with buying their supplies in China and having them come from very, very poor conditions and a lot of pollution, a lot of criteria pollutants in the production, if they can get away with paying as little as possible, if not having a worker voice is something that the law allows them to do, they will. On the worker side, unions have an almost historic approval rate at the moment. Gallup just released a poll, 63% of Americans, 65% of Americans approve of unions. 45% of Republicans approve of unions. Tom Koken from MIT has done some really, really solid research over the last few years. 48% of non-union workers would join a union today if they had a chance. That's almost 50 million workers. So this is one of the things that we have to crack if we're ever going to get the sort of social momentum behind changing the energy system, is the renewable sector's poor track record around unionization and the desire for workers to have better jobs.
So is it then a situation that the union density in the fossil fuel sector is kind of a relic of historical conditions and not something that's kind of a difference inherent to the technologies or something, or what explains that?
So most of the fossil sector was stood up and has been running since a time when it wasn't hard to join a union. And, you know, relic is a pretty loaded word for a young guy to be throwing around, Adam.
Of course.
As a guy who started General Motors in '76. Yeah, it's that. There's nothing inherent in the technologies. In fact, in some places like California, where there are the laws really say that you've got to be a little bit better, and where unions have density and power, there are a lot of unionized renewable projects.
Lynn, maybe we could bring you in here. I mean, what would you know, an uptick in unionization in you know, small, medium-sized renewable firms? How would that change the way they operate, and how would that affect the sector's outlook as a whole?
That's a really interesting question, and it's hard for me to answer that for the companies as a whole, because I think every business is going to have its own unique experience or you know, with unionization. But I think it's important to recognize that in the clean energy industry, there is such a diverse range of what clean energy jobs entail. And so certainly in more construction heavy kinds of positions, such as installation, we would expect to see more unionization. And I think a lot of companies, even smaller businesses, it's common for them to have some degree of government business, right? Whether they're working with the federal government or state or local governments. And a lot of times there are existing regulations in place requiring you know, compliance with certain labor standards in order to access those contracts. So I would think that for those companies that have that experience, it wouldn't be that difficult to transition. But then I think, you know, we also have to recognize there are a whole range of types of jobs that are more service oriented or involving research or science or software development. And a lot of those industries have not really been unionized, and kind of thinking through for companies that rely on a mix of those more service or soft kind of, you know, skill type jobs with the construction focus, it's going to be interesting for them to navigate that blend of different styles of working.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Josh, I mean, let's talk a little bit about standards here. Biden has put out a clean electricity standard that seeks no emissions by 2035. And that's a standard that's more ambitious than we've seen, I think, anywhere else in the country. It's more ambitious than California's clean electricity standard. And yet in that state this summer, we've seen some problems in terms of blackouts and, you know, obviously there are ongoing problems with wildfires. and the nexus, the way that relates to their electricity problems. I mean, does that example have any kind of lessons, either technically or politically, for trying to do this at a more national scale?
I think the biggest lesson that we're learning from California is that climate change is really exacerbating all of the problems that every economic sector and activity confronts. I mean, if you look at what started happening really over the summer in California, where we had record heat, we had people working from home and using electricity in different ways than they did every other year, and putting a different load on the electricity system at the same time. And we had some of the natural gas power plants that the California ISO had expected to be operational and provide the kind of firm power that augments renewables go offline for reasons that we're still trying to figure out. And so it really shows you, under any circumstance, that climate change is making managing any of the electricity systems or other systems that we have more of a challenge, that we have to expect the unexpected. But also it shows why I think in the Vice President's plan, as well as the House Democrats' plan that the Select Committee released and that the Senate Democratic Caucus released, all of them approach addressing climate change through 100% clean, including carbon capture for natural gas, including nuclear, including innovation into advanced nuclear and storage, because there's a recognition that different states and different circumstances are going to require a different mix of both firm and variable electricity resources like renewables and these other assets. So that's the big lesson to take from that. And it's one that we're already seeing really internalized across the ideology of Democrats that unfortunately right now are also, it's the only party that's really advocating for a solution to climate change. So I do think there's a lot of irony to, you know, some of this discussion, which is really being driven by a party who, and it's really unfortunate to get partisan on these issues. I wish, you know, the entire set of Republican voters were as supportive of climate action as they increasingly are on unionization, which, as Brad pointed out, is really good news. But, you know, when the president's plan to respond to the wildfires is, you know, it'll get colder soon, they're the ones who are bringing up some of these issues, and it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the issue of carbon capture and sequestration, but before we do that, Lynn, I'd like to ask you, you know, this electricity standard of Biden's of 2035, I think is arguably maybe his most ambitious policy, you know, I think at all across the board. What is it most important for him to get right? I mean, how does he start going about, you know, getting this, you know, eliminating pollution from the sector? I mean, he won't be there in 2035, but how does he get started on that? How does he set it up for success down the road?
Yeah, well, I think the title of this panel reflects the portfolio of tools that we can look at. So we're talking about standards, which is more regulatory, investment, innovation, and justice. And I think there will be a mix of all of those types of approaches, the sticks and carrot types of approaches. I think what's one of the most critical things to get right early on is to recognize the importance of the private sector in making energy transformations possible and having those dialogues at a very early stage with businesses about how can we best leverage private sector investments through public-private partnerships to make truly ambitious change feasible. Because we will not get this right if we only focus on heavy-handed regulatory approaches that don't look at how do we really drive markets, how do we drive competition, bring down costs. And so, you know, I think that some of the things that we've been calling for, I do expect on the regulatory side of things, we will see a reversal of some of the policies that we've seen, you know, on things such as ozone, methane, social costs of carbon. I would expect we would move more in a direction towards restoring some of those prior regulations, also the CAFE fuel economy standards. But I really think that one of the most critical things is going to be investment. I do think we will see some sort of economic recovery package in the next Congress, and making sure that those investments are channeled very strategically towards financial tools that will leverage money from banks, from private investors, and ambitious investment by the private sector will really be critical. So, we have a broad portfolio of available technologies already that are cost competitive and can help drive decarbonization today, but we still have a huge gap in developing new technologies as well. And so we have to think both in terms of how do we rapidly deploy what's available, but also scale up the innovative technologies that will help decarbonize our future.
Yeah, and I mean, just to follow up on that really quickly, I mean, everyone likes money, right? But I mean, are we going to see divisions between maybe small renewable companies and maybe some of the larger players, maybe utilities? I mean, is the field kind of all rowing in the same direction here, or are we going to start seeing some splits in between different market players just depending on how they operate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in some respects, it's a rising tides float all boats kind of, the more that we can send market signals that promote low carbon technologies, that will be beneficial to everyone. But one of the cases we are frequently making as the clean energy voice for the small business voice for the clean energy economy is that we do need to remember that sometimes the tools available to larger corporations are harder for smaller businesses to access. And I'll give an example. I mentioned earlier government contracts. We hear a lot from companies. We have a lot of members that have gotten R&D grants from the federal government, but when it comes to commercialization or deployment, they are just not able to compete. And so when it comes to getting things like energy savings performance contracts or government contracts, the amount of bureaucracy, frankly, and just difficulty navigating that and the many relationships that you need to establish, it's not really tenable for small businesses. But some of them do have unique, it's not just like, okay, here's a mega solar developer and a tiny solar developer. They may have a unique solution to offer that could be brought to bear at a particular installation. And so I think just promoting greater access is important. And and I do think, the more that we can, again, just sort of help the private sector step up and leverage limited federal resources, whether there's a variety of bills, for example, pending right now that would reauthorize DOE loan programs or extend lending to community green banks and things of that nature. And I think the more that we can kind of tap into tools like that to give communities power to sort of implement the solutions at the local level that work best, that will help promote a little bit greater access within the clean energy industry.
That's really interesting. Brad, I was listening to Biden talk yesterday, and it struck me that I realized, when he's talking about this standard for 2035, he doesn't say we're going to go all renewables by 2035. He says we're going to end carbon pollution, which seems to keep the door open for stuff like carbon capture and sequestration, all these sorts of other, non-renewable energy sources. I mean, is there a way, is that because there's just no good way for Democrats to talk about ending fossil fuels? Or is there a way for the party to talk about, transitioning to something, that doesn't really require fossil fuels? Is there a way to do that without getting, crosswise with unions?
Well, the reason that carbon capture is in Vice President Biden's plans, the reason that it is in the report of the Select Committee, the reason that it is in the bills that Energy and Commerce was warming up this year is because the science says we need carbon capture to make it work, to reach our goals, right? And so while everybody says follow the science, they're talking about certain chapters in the IPCC. They need to go a couple chapters down and follow that science and not be selective about the science that they want to follow. So it's not because of some way of talking, which is a point, we can turn to that in a second. It's because the science says if you don't have carbon capture it's going to be very difficult to meet our goals, and it's going to be more costly to meet our goals. It's going to be very difficult in sectors like industry. With respect to ending fossil fuels, it's a horrible way to talk about things. The object is not to keep fossil fuels in the ground. The object is to keep emissions out of the air. And so that means things like carbon capture. That means things like electrified vehicles. That means advanced nuclear has to be part of the mix. It means that we shouldn't lose our nuclear plants, our existing nuclear fleet. So all of those things are a part of the mix. We've got this existential problem. We have to move as fast as we can. And it's got to be an all technologies on deck kind of approach. And I think that you see across the board, really, with the Democrats, the plans they're developing, that's the approach they're taking, because there's no sense in leaving a single arrow in the quiver when we got to win this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to linger on that for a second, I guess, because, you know, you have heard Democrats, at least Biden and the Democrats who are kind of aligned with him, being very sensitive to that union perspective. But at the same time, I mean, they are talking about, you know, displacing oil demand through EVs and all of these other things that potentially could lead to fewer, you know, fossil fuel jobs. And it seems like their response to that, or at least the response of many Democrats, is, well, yes, you know, these jobs might be transitioning away, but look at all of the renewables jobs that we're creating. And to me, I don't know. I mean, we've gone through now a couple years where, you know, learn to code has become like a cliche for, you know, political indifference to workers' problems and work disruption. I mean, is that just another way, is saying like, oh, well, we're creating renewables jobs? Is that just, you know, learn to code by another name? Or, you know, I mean, how should the messaging around this be?
I think that with the environmental community and really the full scope of the environmental community, we've moved past that discussion. Everybody understands the concepts of just transition. Everybody's seen the example of the German Coal Commission. And the truth is, what we need is for the ability of all the jobs to be good jobs, so that people have faith that as we make these changes, they will find a good job. Here, I tell the story all the time. Coal employment in the United States peaked in 1923 at about 720,000. Coal production did not peak until about 2008, when the industry employed 86,000. What happened in the meantime? There was a lot of advances. There was a lot of mechanization. We stopped using mules in mines, longwall mining, western mining, all very, very productive. There was no upheaval. Why? Because people from the coal fields could leave West Virginia or Kentucky and go to Detroit or Chicago or Pittsburgh and get a good factory job. When people know that losing their fossil fuel job does not mean losing their health care, does not mean putting their family in poverty. It could mean that, hey, guess what? All the wind turbine factories are not going to be in West Virginia, but we can provide good family supporting, labor-friendly jobs. Then that transition happens a lot faster.
That's really interesting. Well, let's return to this issue then of carbon capture and sequestration, because Josh, you know, I mean, Brad just mentioned the IPCC report, which says, you know, for many of these scenarios in which we keep warming to a not awfully catastrophic level, it usually requires some level of CCS or negative emissions, especially if we want to do it in a way that's lower cost. But I mean, what would you tell people who are still skeptical, not because of, you know, the IPCC's modeling, but just because they look and they're saying, okay, well, you're adding extra costs to fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are already getting priced out by renewables. So how does that economics work? I mean, what would you say to those people?
I think let's take a step back on this first. And I think a point that Brad made is particularly important here about how are the decisions being made about what is the mix of resources that are going to be deployed and where. And, you know, what we've seen, there's a big challenge now in how we're used to the federal government at the executive branch level being run, which is, unfortunately, for the last 3 years, by a very political agenda, mostly driven by the what's perceived to be the personal political interest of the president and a handful of his advisors. So expertise is derided, ignored, dismissed. long-term planning to achieve a goal that the nation would benefit from is just utterly not part of the equation. What we're seeing from the plan that the Biden campaign, amongst many, the Blue-Green Alliance has put one out, Third Way has a plan. There are a number of plans that say, let's look at what not just the IPCC report says, but also the National Climate Assessment and a variety of other sources of the full mix of options we need. And it says not just will carbon capture be likely necessary for a portion of the electricity sector in the United States, but also for other industrial processes. One of the things that we've been waiting for and we've seen a little bit, we haven't seen nearly as much as we need to, is opportunities for truly clean manufacturing to come back to the United States and thrive. We started to see steel production being tested with carbon capture in other parts of the world. That should be built here. That can be built in a way that is efficient, that there is the price of carbon, which is right now, we're all bearing the price of climate impacts. And as we start to recognize that instead of bearing that price by seeing what's happening in the West, what happened with Derecho in Iowa, that we're going to say, fossil fuels without carbon capture on them shouldn't be used because that is truly expensive. But if we use fossil fuels with carbon capture and really go through the full process of development, deployment, and commercialization with the recognition that we're going to get to a point, and there are some companies out there already that look very promising, where they can get to the point where they can be competitive with other options because they're providing other services, or they are providing the kind of heat or other options that renewables aren't suited to either for electricity or for manufacturing purposes. So I think that we all need to approach the entire set of questions around addressing climate change and what technologies and how with real humility that we don't know the answers. We don't know how the markets are going to respond. We don't know how the technologies are going to always respond. And so we really need as much optionality as possible. And that's what we're really seeing in the Biden plan, amongst others.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of optionality, Lynn, I'm wondering if you can tell us, CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, has been around as a concept for quite a while. It's been used to kind of help do enhanced oil recovery. Why have the policies and the research institutions that have allowed other, energy technologies, wind and solar in particular, to go from being kind of a niche, research problem into, this thing that utilities can plan around and invest huge sums of money in? Why haven't those same processes and institutions done the same thing for carbon capture?
Yeah, I think one of the things we found in terms of the investments that we've put into renewable energy development, for example, really helped to drive costs down very aggressively to the point where now it's cost competitiveness more than regulatory signals in many locations that are really driving the deployment of these industries. So we saw a very successful transition of the financial model there. And so far, we just haven't seen the cost reductions or the market signals that are needed in CCS to really deploy it at scale. But I agree. I think what Brad was saying earlier, and Josh's commentary on the need for CCS, it's going to have to be part of the technology solution and the portfolio of available technology. So, I think we could see a variety of possible paths forward on this. One of the things that we typically advocate for is, at least when it comes to regulatory approaches, taking as broad and agnostic of a technology approach as possible in setting goals for what are the emissions reductions you want to achieve, what's the target that you want to get to, and let various technologies, let people innovate, let them come up with the new financial models, let them come up with the new technological models for achieving those goals. But having those goals in place, having those, some target does help drive price signals. So I think that will be helpful. But I also think we, at the same time, do need to continue to promote strategic federal investment in the research, development, and early commercialization side of technologies that we think hold promise. So we have to be technology agnostic in our regulatory approach, but think a little bit through where are areas where we feel like we need strategic placement of federal dollars, and this could be one of those areas. And I think we have been seeing in recent years a bit of diversification within CCS beyond the traditional ground-based sequestration models that we've seen in enhanced oil recovery, to thinking through what are a range of things we could do with carbon. And there's more research coming out on carbon utilization, making products out of carbon, and some of these could be very economically viable, high price kind of items that have market opportunities, as well as air capture and a whole variety of new approaches. So I'm hoping that through some combination of market signals that really try to continue to further drive aggressive carbon reductions, coupled with these strategic investments and innovation, that we can get there.
Yeah. Well, we we're almost out of time here, but maybe each of you could talk a little bit about just some closing thoughts. Just what are we looking forward to the next year, if it's a Biden administration, if we're still under Trump. I mean, what would you take away? What would you hope people take away from this conversation? And what would you really emphasize maybe that we didn't have a chance to talk about yet?
I'll go first, sure. Under either scenario, I do think the technology push is going to be really, really important. We have to invest those dollars, and we have to get those technologies into the marketplace and get them deployed. Faster deployment is a huge key, no matter who's going to be there. If Biden wins, I think we got to look at what happens in the Senate. And, if the Republicans keep the Senate, then it really is going to be a pure market push. And there's some legislation around out there to do that, right? And Republicans that are warming up to fighting climate change. So I think that the public attitudes have changed enough that both parties are going to have to address this somehow. Obviously, we'll get a lot further, a lot faster, and probably have a better chance of avoiding catastrophe if Biden wins. But either way, we're going to move forward.
Lynn, how about you?
I think one of the things I'm hopeful to see in the next Congress is, we've talked a lot about technology innovation, but I hope to see policy innovation as well. I think we are seeing, just as all the panelists have spoken about, increasing bipartisan support for clean energy and recognition that we do have a climate crisis and are going to need to do something to take action. And we're seeing growing bipartisan support in Congress and growing pressure on policymakers to have a policy solution. And some of the historic Democratic approaches are still there and are still being debated and discussed, but we're also seeing Republicans increasingly trying to come up with what are the conservative-friendly approaches that we can get behind. And I'm hopeful that this can move us into a central direction where we can try to find some real pragmatic policies that could advance Congress. And again, there will be a mix of some regulatory approaches in the administration and Congress. There will be investment, there will be innovation, but we are seeing creative new ideas come forward, like in the tax code, how can we unlock investment for innovative technologies? How can we allow companies to monetize tax credits upfront rather than waiting till the project is making money? And then how can we better unlock dollars? So I hope to see continued progress on that policy innovation, and hopefully we can do so in a bipartisan way without the bickering that we sometimes do see.
No bickering here. Josh, why don't you bring us home?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much, Adam. I really appreciate it. Look, I think the interesting thing is actually, despite a lot of press coverage about how there's fighting amongst Democrats, I've been involved in climate policy and policy making in general within the Democratic side for 25 years. There is a shocking and exciting amount of agreement, including amongst a lot of the different advocates, including labor, as Brad was pointing out, and environmental groups, that if there is a Biden administration and Democrats have control of the agenda in Congress, between standards like a clean energy standard, maybe in a zero emissions vehicle standard, certainly Buy Clean and Buy American for industrial standards, real investment in innovation and infrastructure, and also focus on environmental and worker justice. We know what the climate and clean energy agenda would be fit within the broader agenda that a next administration is going to have to do to deal with the pandemic and the deeper economic recession that the pandemic induced. Because I've been working for a long time in this town at this point, I am far less optimistic. I think on specific ideas, there is bipartisanship still. I'm excited to see that some progress may be made on the Manchin-Murkowski Clean Energy Innovation Bill, which is about clean energy innovation. It is not a full climate bill. But I think that we have never seen a more stark set of options if you care about climate than between the current administration and what the Democrats are offering. And I wish I could take off my partisan hat. Third Way was created in part, we should have partners on the Republican side. But I can't, it's not even one hand. I've got maybe one, my thumb of Republicans who are genuinely committed to any sort of consideration of climate action. And so it's unfortunate, but we can sort of see two very clear and different visions of what will happen depending on what happens with the election.
Well, on that note, I want to thank all of our panelists here. I mean, great discussion, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. I've gotten a lot out of it, so thank you very much.
Adam, there's just one more issue that I have to make sure the audience knows where I stand on.
Please. I don't think you lost any friends, although maybe, I don't know.
Well, my Spartan wife is not that thrilled with it, but that's
all right, folks. Brad Markell is Labor Co-Chair and Executive Director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council. Lynn Abramson is President of the Clean Energy Business Network. Josh Freed, Senior Vice President of Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. And I am Adam Ayton. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam, Josh, Brad, and Lynn. I'd like to welcome Todd Alec, Chair and Professor of the Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences at the University of Michigan.
Hey, thank you very much, Jared. Third Way and the University of Michigan, I'd like to thank everyone for spending the afternoon with us. We hope you enjoyed your time. When we initially started thinking about planning our second Fastest Path Summit back in April, we didn't imagine we were going to be doing this via this fancy Whova video platform, but COVID continues to be a complete jerk, and so we adapt. And I think we adapted well. I was really pleased with this conversation and our start to the Fastest Path Summit. Thanks to Stacey Abrams, who got us started in talking about what's at stake relative to climate change. And I also appreciate the contributions from both panels. They were outstanding. I hope everyone is enthusiastic enough about this discussion that you'll come back and join us next Tuesday. The theme for Tuesday will be innovation. We're going to start at noon, just like we did today, also using this Whova/Zoom platform. Our keynote will be Richard Kaufman, who's the Climate and Energy Advisor for Governor Cuomo in New York. We'll have another two, what I think will be great panels, one on how much innovation actually matters, and one on the potential for advanced nuclear in global markets. And finally, what I think will be the highlight of the day will be a set of University of Michigan students talking about their contributions to the Fastest Path. So I hope you come back. I'm glad you joined us and look forward to continuing the conversation with you next Tuesday. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd. We'd like to thank all of you for attending the first day of the Fastest Path to Zero Summit. Remember, we are back next Tuesday at noon, and we'll be joined by Richard Kaufman, former Obama White House official Lisa Cook, Jennifer Haberkamp of the University of Michigan, Julian Brave Noisecat of Data for Progress, and we'll be launching an international advanced nuclear map. Tickets are still available at thirdway.org/events. See you then.